you and I today are going to chat through what is it that clients are really looking for in a presentation. And I think it's worth noting that really many clients actually feel that research results are pretty poorly presented. So it's not enough just to conduct research properly and analyse the findings well, but it's equally important to know how to present these findings to your client. So I have a couple of quotes here from the net, and really what I do is to put ourselves in each other's shoes for a moment. So the top one here is the client. So a client really does have a great deal riding on a presentation, just as much as you do, and look, I would argue perhaps even more. If the presentation doesn't go well, a client's going to look bad in front of their managers and really anyone who's in the audience. Because after all, it's the client, it's your client that's chosen you as the agency or as their researcher. So, you know, we've got a lot of skin in this game. So if we look at the bottom, what might the researcher or supplier be thinking in this presentation? And I think, you know, I was on the supplier side for, you know, a number of decades. And so I know what it's like. But let's think of you as the researcher for a moment. I have done hours and hours of work. I've done late nights, whether it's qual or quant, there's always late nights. And it really comes down pretty much to this one PowerPoint presentation to demonstrate how much value I've added. So I need to show my client all the analysis that I've done. I want them to know how hard I've worked. A lot of time, a lot of information. You know, it's fair to say that we really are in this together, and we've each invested a great deal of work. Now, the next thing I want to talk a little about are hygiene factors. As Sue said, you might think that these seem pretty basic, but I have to say, okay, they're not sexy, they're not particularly interesting, but you don't want these little routine things to detract from your presentation, and it's amazing just how often that does happen. So firstly, you really have to avoid being late and stick to the allotted time for your presentation. Pretty basic, but often not done. You don't want to be in a room with senior people watching you set up, and you don't want senior people leaving your presentation to go to their next meeting because you've run out of time and you haven't even got to your conclusion yet. So really important. The second hygiene factor is really about your equipment, and I think have a checklist and have a backup plan just in case something goes wrong. And finally, a little word of caution from me in terms of multimedia, and that's not to overdo it. For me, it's kind of, it's akin to a perfume or an aftershave, and that really is a little does go a very long way. Okay, well, let's start to actually look at the content of your presentation. And the first thing I would say is you really need to instill confidence with your client and your client's audience. And I think sometimes that researchers can actually forget that ultimately the client's going to need to make a decision based on what they hear in that presentation. So it's important that you are across all of the detail, that you are prepared, that you've done a lot of that questioning and hypothesizing beforehand. And in fact, you really need to think a little bit like a journalist, look at all of those facts, and then pull together a story in the way that Sue Bell outlined earlier today. And look, of course, you do need to be truthful. We are after a factual story, not fiction. And what I would say is that even what seems to be bad news is important news. Because it will prevent ultimately the business, your client, perhaps making the wrong decision. So maybe launching a product that's going to ultimately fail in market, or an ad that's not going to resonate with your consumers. And look, that's why we do research. It's about mitigating risk. So for the client, everything is around mitigating risk. The biggest thing I would say for a client is that we absolutely hate surprises. And I think this is actually one of the biggest questions for a researcher, is how they decide to involve their client in the working up of their presentation. And in some ways it can depend a little on the particular client. Now, for me, it's absolutely about partnership, and I definitely want to be involved. So as soon as you have the flow of your presentation fleshed out, a little bit of that diagram or a straw man, I would suggest that you do run it past your client at that stage, and it gives your client time to reflect and also to give you the required feedback. And ultimately, that's going to help you when you're in front of your audience. Your client knows the politics, the inner workings of their organisation much better than you do. So as a client, we can help you understand your audience and whether perhaps there is some politics or some hot potatoes that you need to be aware of in the room. And when you're preparing your presentation, it really is around clarity of thoughts. And the biggest thing to ask yourself, or perhaps ask your client, is have you actually answered the objective of the research? Great to have a story, but you need to be answering that main objective. And also being clear about the message you want to get across to your audience, I think will actually help you craft your entire presentation. My other little word of caution, and this too probably comes from all my time as a supplier, and that is to understand the balance of doing maybe another day's analysis versus using that time to work on your presentation and your recommendation. So a really sloppy presentation will actually make your audience question the validity of the research that you've done. So really important to save time for that back end, crafting your story. I hear terrible things about presentations still being worked up in the taxi on the way to a client's office. Definitely not what you want to be doing. Let me just talk a little bit now about storytelling from my perspective. When I first started in market research, there were two very different documents that we would give our clients. One was a report and the other was a presentation. And way back then, these two were very different documents with very different purposes. Now, these days, we generally have one deck that serves both of these purposes, and I would argue that sometimes serves both of these purposes poorly. What you need to be doing is telling a story, and telling a story in a very compelling way. So you need to prevent what I would call the kind of show up and throw up kind of presentation. So the shorter and the more pithy, the better. I would also say that we want you to actually tell us a story, not read us a story, and there is a great distinction. I found this lovely little analogy about this, and it said that the last time someone deliberately read to you, it was probably your mother, and she was probably trying to put you to bed or put you to sleep. Now, clearly, that is not the impact that you're looking for your client. The other thing is about being flexible and really keeping an eye on the body language in the room. So your audience pretty much is going to let you know when they want you to move on or perhaps even to wrap up. So I would be looking at your audience and taking those cues, particularly from your key client. So let me wrap up now and say, lastly for me, there's one little test I think everyone should apply, and that is the so what test. And if it's anything that I leave with you today, it's that one little nugget. Because ultimately, your client needs to make a business decision from your work. So you need to leave them with a really clear and solid recommendation. And I think this is where you really can work best with your client and truly understand the decision that your client has to make from this research. We tend to only go to research with really big issues, so we do have a decision that we're trying to make. So again, research from a client's point of view, it's all about risk mitigation, it's about trade-offs, and ultimately building a decision. So use that so what test. So what for my client, and that's the message that I'd like to leave you with.